Okay, so the subject for this week is speech communities, which is in fact the first chapter in the textbook, the first article that is displayed in the textbook, and one of the oldest pieces that appears in the book. The main idea, of course, is something that we have seen before, that was mentioned in the very first week of this class from Benjamin Worth, who was thinking of the ways in which we can use language in specific ways, and he kind of brought up that terms of a speech community. And so we've seen this quote before, we're going to see it again. We cut nature up and organize it into concepts and describe significances as we do, largely because we are parties to an agreement to organize it in this way, an agreement that holds throughout our speech community and is codified in the patterns of our language. And in this context, of course, Worth does not specify what that speech community is. He's kind of using this term in a very loose manner, which is nice for our purposes because it's not a particularly scientific term. It doesn't seem to have any specific attachment to it. And compared to a lot of concepts that we have seen so far that have this very scientific name to it, it's kind of refreshing to just conceptualize things as essentially what they are. That people speak with others, and you can define these others as a speech community. But of course, it's such a powerful concept, on the other hand, that it turns out that more people kind of ran with this idea and took up this idea, including John Gumpers, that is the author of this week's reading. Now, the second part of Worf's idea, and something that we have mentioned also previously in this class, is that the agreement is, of course, an implicit and unstated one, but its terms are absolutely obligatory. We cannot talk at all except by subscribing to the organization and classification of data which the agreement decrees. So this unstated agreement that we have qualified or called a system before is something that needs to be there so that we can speak. It's also something that we don't talk about, because then we would spend our lifetimes studying linguistics essentially to figure out how to talk, which would not be practicable, and it would defeat the purpose of language. But I think it's especially useful for what we're doing here, because it's something that we mentioned last week in the context of the honorifics and the formality of language, that within specific interactions, you will have to identify the specific level of formality that is, expected or required from you, depending on what the terms are, right? The idea of the fact that you are expected to conform to a certain form of formality means that you know, or you are generally aware that there are those rules. But you, as a person who has a sense of agency, who has their own language, you can still make mistakes, or you can still intentionally break those rules. You can make people behave in different ways by the ways in which you use language. And so in the sense that Worf is talking about here, that the terms are absolutely obligatory, they are obligatory as far as we assume that there is such a thing as a speech community. And that's important because that's something that's very relatable in terms of those one-to-one contacts that we've had so far, that when people are talking about things and you expect them to behave a certain way, and you, on the other hand, will conform to those expectations, that conversation is going to happen. Well, the same principle happens here with the community, is that when people are conforming to the expectations that are set upon them and other people expect them to speak a certain way, well, then you have a community. You have a thing that you can identify as, within this particular group of people, there are rules. If somebody breaks the rules, something is going to happen, social consequences, as we have called them last week, or perhaps in the context of this, maybe the end of this community. And that's a very important concept to put into our minds here, because community, generally speaking, is something that we take for granted. We kind of walk into a community of some sort, and we kind of seek to join it at some point, but we don't have so much this feeling of the community disappearing, breaking apart, unless there's something critical that happens, something that would make the change so visible that people can no longer hold together as a society, some cataclysmic event of some sort. And so Gumpers, in his definition or his view of the speech community, kind of goes towards this this elaboration of what a speech community does. And so this is from the article reading for this week, dated from 1968. In analyzing linguistic phenomena within a socially defined universe, however, the study is of language usage as it reflects more general behavior norms. This universe is the speech community, any human aggregate characterized by regular and frequent interaction by means of a shared body of verbal signs and set off from similar aggregates by significant differences in language usage. So there's 100 things that are really great about this article. It's really short, and it's really to the point. Gumpers, kind of like Boaz, born in Germany, 1920s or something or another, Jewish, had to escape out of Germany, starts moving around Europe for a while until it finally sails to the United States. He was trained as a chemist, as a physical scientist, but eventually realizes that the idea of language and social science is a lot more fun than chemistry, and becomes a social scientist by that way. At UC Berkeley, where some of Franz Boas's most notorious students are working at the time. So there's two schools essentially that are born out of Boas, one in Columbia, New York, the other one at UC Berkeley. And so his idea, especially for the context of linguistics here, has to do with what he mentions here. So it's kind of capped out from the beginning. So the linguistic phenomena is most of what we have talked about so far. This socially defined universe is the speech community that we are talking about now. And it is a more general behavior norm. That is, you have this possibility of variation within a community. That it's not a monolithic group of people, and that there are things that are going to happen that are more generally understood, and within that, people figure out their behavior, figure out their expectations. So it's not as simple as a mathematical equation of you speak in a certain way and you are therefore part of our group. It's more a matter of these are the things that we do, what can we do with them? And so the universe here is the speech community. And it's important to think of this as a universe because it sets up kind of a system of a livelihood, if you will, maybe an ecology, as we'll talk about in a second. The sense that within this universe, there are living things. There are maybe not so living things. There may be things that are not things at all, but they are still part of the general behavior that we have. For example, things that we have kind of mentioned last week is that sometimes when you are speaking with somebody from your speech community, you will use the language that is a little bit less coded than you would with other people, and you might conversely use even more code to prevent others from understanding you. So you might differ in the way that you speak your specific language as a way to identify yourself as a person who speaks that language as opposed to anybody else. You can also do it the other way if somebody is deceased, for example. Talking about the dead in specific ways could make them angry, and as part of your general understanding of your universe, your world, the worldview as we have mentioned before, you don't speak ill of the dead, or you don't speak ill of people who are not there. You might have this sense, you might have been told this, if you say something bad about something there's not somebody who's not there, their ears are whistling or something, or somebody knows something that you are saying now. It's kind of a magical way to view the world, but it's kind of a social expectation is that if you have something to say to people, you just tell them. You don't just gossip. Although gossip can have its value, it could be a negative value sometimes. And so the universe here starts with a human aggregate, so a group of people characterized by regular and frequent interaction. And this is also important in contributing to this idea of the living thing that is the speech community, because people who are, by their regular interaction, aware of others, and so aware of who's there and who's speaking and who is part of the group, will have a much better sense of how that speech community works. And again, this is something that's very relatable if you have a group of friends that you had to leave to go to college here or to go to school somewhere else, right? And you go back and you see those friends and there's something that's changed. That doesn't mean that they're no longer your friends. That doesn't mean that anybody is particularly different, but time has passed. And if you haven't had this contact with them, well, you're missing parts of the world, part of the shared environment that you had up until that point. And, if you make that last long enough, if you don't have the regular, frequent interaction, the whole idea here becomes very different of how to interact with people who may not be interacting with you that much. And so you have this shared body of verbal signs, the language, the sounds that we have used so far, set up from similar aggregates by differences in language usage. That once you make that different sign with somebody else, once you use a different word or you make a different sound coming out of your mouth than what people expected from you, they will see it, they will realize it, and that will essentially mark you as different. Whether the community accepts that as an acceptable difference or not, that's for the community to figure out. Question?
I don't think you're projecting the slides on the online class.
All right. Thank you. So this basically exists in the book anyway, so if you need to refer to that or the article, actually it's the first page of the article that's posted online, so easy to find. We haven't missed anything too drastic so far. And now I have to rethink about what I was saying. Yes, so significant differences in language usage, which allow you to identify the things that are part of your expectations and part of the things you don't expect. So again, you expect things to be in a certain way, and once you have those things match your expectations, you can identify that as straightforward, this is how we do. If it doesn't match your expectations, if the significant difference appears, then it is very easy to fall by the wayside, to be marked as somebody who is different from the language community. And in a way, this is kind of a very scientific way in which Gumpers is seeing this, is that this is a matter of kind of object permanence, if you will, that the thing is there as long as it is there. If it's no longer there, if it no longer appears as a live thing, well, then that language community would become something different. And so in another article that came back, I guess, well, 14 years later, Gumpers keeps on elaborating this idea of the speech community. And of course, the rest of the articles that you see in the readings that we have, a lot of them will refer to the general process that Gumpers go through to the speech community. But he very much digs into this idea of the community as a universe and the universe as a living ecosystem. So another definition the same guy gives of a speech community is a system of organized diversity held together by common norms and aspirations. Members of such a community typically vary with respect to certain beliefs and other aspects of behavior. Such variation, which seems irregular when observed at the level of the individual, nonetheless shows systematic regularities at the statistical level of social facts. So again, you have that very scientific kind of hard science way to describe things, and that you have these systematic irregularities at statistical level of social facts, because of course there are going to be variation. Everyone who works in physical sciences knows this, that things are never just falling on the grid. That's just not how the universe works. Nothing is a grid. We use grids because it is much easier for us to make sense of the very vast complexity that exists around us. Now, this particular definition appears in a book called Discourse Strategies, because of course the general understanding of how the speech community works has to do with the way that people will more or less consciously, more or less intentionally use language within specific groups. And here, if you have this organized diversity that exists, in other words, this kind of loose organizing of people that are held by norms and aspirations. So you can see here how this is kind of moving away from what he called in the previous slide the regular and frequent interactions. Because, regular could be once every 10 years. Frequent, well, it kind of seems to be a lot less than 10 years. Unless you are thinking of things on a much larger background, on a much larger scale. That it's not just the scale of the individual themselves, it could be the scale of the community. The community which could outlast each and every one of the individuals, because you have parents and you have their kids and maybe their kids' kids and maybe however many generations of people that are born within this speech community. So let's say that we were taking the English language as a speech community, which is possible. It's not very useful, but it could make sense. You take everyone that speaks American English, British English, Australian English, and anybody that speaks English as a second language, all these people into one and the same speech community, you can have a pretty good understanding of how they are going to speak with one another using a specific set of words. Now, if you know the difference between those different forms of the English language, then you will very easily see how those things could fall apart, that somebody says a word that exists in their language, maybe that means something different in the other language. Then the idea of the English language as a speech community kind of starts to lose its meaning. Eventually, if you add to that what he calls here the norms and aspirations, or maybe a more general understanding about religion, culture, politics, whatever, all those things will kind of typically break down to much smaller groups that eventually become much more meaningful for us as far as talking about society. That the thing that keeps us together is not just language, because language is just a means for people to communicate. But I can say hello to you, having never met you before and never meeting you again. That doesn't make us a community. That makes me a weirdo who talked to you for some reason or another. As opposed to repeating those interactions, having a meaning, an intent behind this, and perhaps, carrying this over the course of, let's say, the semester for the context of this class, let's say maybe another semester if you take another one of my classes, or let's say you hate me and you don't want to take these classes again, and we don't have to interact anymore. Again, not a community. Keeping on intentionally with those same aspirations, the line of communication, all of a sudden, we have something more than just the language we are using now. So there could be plenty of variation between whatever is happening in our lives, the certain beliefs and aspects of behavior, but if we have a way to communicate on the specific level that makes sense within our group, well, we have something more than a language. We have communication that works in a certain way that allows for this thing to be a lot more meaningful than either the society that we live in or the language that we use, both of which are very large capacities that are not particularly suited for us, as opposed to whatever conversation we are having. And to further the idea of the speech community as some kind of ecological group, then we can start thinking of the larger world diversity that exists and put those diversities into more or less connecting systems. Because of course, biology, chemistry, and all of this dictates that we are sharing similar environments, that we are living within somewhat of a similar space, we are interacting within somewhat of a similar space, and there's nothing that prevents us from actually being part of many spaces at the same time. That you live within a city, but also you live within a city that's around the forest. And so you have this interaction with the forest sometimes you are in interaction with the lake, sometimes with the mountain, sometimes with your car, sometimes with all these things. And you can't make sense of all of these at the same time. And in fact, you do that at all time. So language here is allowing us to be more than just one person within a community, but this one person that can do a bunch of things, embodying, constructing, constituting this meaningful participation in a society or a culture, a larger group of people that you may connect with if you feel like it or if you don't feel like it. So if you have a group of people that you play football with, then that's your football group. But you also have another group of people that plays video game, and those two groups may be kind of overlapping, but kind of not. And you have different ways to relate to those people depending on whether you interact with them with the football, with the video games, or with both the football and the video game. And maybe there's another group that you interact with that likes, again, mountains or bicycles or whatever. Then you can create these very dense connections with a bunch of people across the worldviews, because maybe you don't share anything in particular besides those activities that you do, but maybe a larger culture, maybe a larger history, or whatever other practices you may have. You have a question?
Yeah. What was the book that the definition was on the last slide?
Discourse Strategies, 1982. Any questions about this? Okay, so the context of the language itself is more or less observable. And Gumpers point that out, the idea that from the outside, external observer, it might not make sense, but you can, as a person who is studying speech communities, look at the ways in which people organize these communities. But how do you find them? In other words, how do you take those different interactions that people have with the intent that they have, with all of the diversity that comes around it, and start to make sense of this as a community? In other words, how do you separate the fact that people interact for X amount of reasons and the fact that people will communicate for a specific reason at a specific time with a specific person with a larger group of people? So looking at the larger amount of linguistic features will allow to make sense of how they connect those ideas through language. Now, the system of meaning that we have mentioned so far, we're not going to delve too deep into, again, the meaning of meaning, which used to be a lecture that I did, but it's too much. The idea that you are using certain words to mean certain things is a very easy way to reflect those connections. As I was mentioning earlier, so different people who speak British English, American English, Australian English, whatever, you can take those words that correspond to those ideas and say, well, these people say that a biscuit is this thing, this other person says that a biscuit is this thing, therefore they certainly belong to different speech communities because they are referring to different things using different words. Or same things with different words, or the same thing, you get the idea. So this is an aspect that we have mentioned in terms of semantics before. Semantics as the study of the meaning of things. But as we have mentioned before, language is based on the system of sounds. And of course, the sounds create the words, and we can use the words to make those representations any other sense. So phonology, the way that you sound the sounds, is also a way that you can see the linguistic features, because you can see that a specific sound is used to say specific words. So something that people could hear very easily within a British accent, an Australian accent, whatever. It doesn't matter that you can pinpoint if this is British, Scottish, Irish, whatever. It doesn't. That's not so much important. What's important is that you know which one is yours and you know which one is not. In this case, you can certainly see that people who speak in a certain way sound in a certain way. And if those people sound in a certain way, certainly they are going to identify as members of some kind of linguistic group. Another larger context that we have mentioned before is the syntax. In other words, the sentence. That's just a very complicated word to say that people use within a language. The words organized in a specific way, that's sentence structure. Now, syntagmatic way to look at language is to look at the way that people organize those words into sentences and how those sentences make sense. And within the way that those sentences make sense, you will see that people will realize those different aspects differently. Now, this gets us back to last week's conversation with the coding or the structuring of language, that within the way that you are structuring those interactions based on your shared environment or not so shared environment, people are going to speak differently. So you assume or you expect that people are seeing the same thing you do. You are going to formulate your sentences in a way that makes sense to that shared environment you have. Conversely, you don't assume that people see it, or you assume that they don't see it either way. Then you will create your sentences in a way that reflects your perception of that shared or not so shared environment. The other side of that issue is that you also need to make sense of the sociological expectations of it, or how the society allows for those forms of meaning to come. Something that I've mentioned very many times in this class already, that you can, if you will, choose whatever word to refer to whatever thing you want. That's entirely possible. It's within the realm of the possibility. But as we have pointed out, it is not a very fruitful, not a very productive to use language, because there's a larger social group in which those terms, those sounds, those connections are already made. So if you decide to use a different word to refer to the thing that your group is using, then you are going against the rules of the group. Again, you are marking yourself as different from your speech community in the terms that we have talked about today. And so this has to do with discourse, essentially the way that people interact over certain topics and the way that people will use certain topics of conversation and not use others, of course. And it also has to do with the power relationships, as we have mentioned, and also last week. People establish those matters of status within their society that kind of create the type of things that you can talk about, that you are allowed to talk about. You could extend that to a matter of maybe expertise, that some things you are able, some discussions you are able to talk about, but some others you're not. Or, if you are parents with children, and there's parents that are talking about some subjects that are not meant for children, and children are not meant to hear, essentially. It's not necessarily a political power as in the sense of, there's just some things that you don't need to be aware of at some points in your life, and it's probably better that you are not at this point in time. Again, topics of larger importance, maybe a little bit stressful. And so, in terms of what we have seen before, the linguistic features that you can identify within the speech is the matter of langue in Saussure's idea, or the matter of code in Jacobson's ideas. Similarly, on the other hand, the sociolinguistic feature would be part of what Saussure called parole and what Jacobson called message. Either way, we can't separate the two, even though, yes, sometimes we have to, because that's the only way that we can approach them, but the two will feed one another, because it is a matter of language, and because you are always talking to somebody. You might be talking to yourself, you might be talking to God or something outside of that, you might be talking to somebody else, but either way, the language is sounded out for a reason. If you're talking to yourself in your head, well, you're not talking. You're just having this conversation in your head. So the language itself here is not particularly useful to you. If you're talking the words out loud into somebody else, we are talking about something very different. So if you're looking for a speech community, looking at the language, the langue, the code, is one thing, but you have to connect it to the way that the larger group is going to come together around these ideas. Now the question becomes, because we have mentioned this before, if the use of language already comes from pre-existing amounts of codes and pre-existing amounts of messages. In other words, when you use language, you're not using all of the available sounds that exist in your mouth, in your body, in your biology. You're only using the specific sounds that are common in your language. And similarly, when you are talking, having a conversation, you're not mentioning, plucking out of the ether all of the possible topics of the universe. You're really mentioning the ones that are relevant to your culture. It kind of makes sense that within this context, there's going to be a limited amount of interactions that exist. Perhaps a large one, but still very limited in the sense that in a specific context, people will be expected to talk about specific things. So if you are in North America, you will expect the North American languages to be spoken. That doesn't mean that you can't be another language there, that you can be a tourist, or you can be an immigrant, or you can be some other kind of group of people that speak a different language, but the general expectation is a limited amount of languages. And, in that case, Mexico is part of North America. Indigenous folks are part of North America. Those are languages that are North Americans by every sense of the word, but not generally expected within the discourse, within the power relationships that exist in the United States. And the question becomes, how do you account for these? How do you account for things that are expected in a way, but also kind of rare, kind of not frequent. They are there, but they just happen on a lower basis than other things. Like, hurricanes, volcanoes, things that we know exist, we know can happen, but we don't expect those things to happen. We don't expect those because for the most part they don't. That doesn't mean that they will never happen. Same thing about life and death, obviously. And so some people have tried to organize this idea of speech communities as nests, as language nests, if you will, or nested speech communities, if you want to put it in that way, but that within a specific space, people will create these smaller spaces in which the language will be more or less used. So we propose a model of nested speech communities configurations. Each speech community configuration or field is arranged in terms of distinct types of linguistic variables, which in turn reflect increasingly expanding fields of interaction that individuals maintain with pertinent others in the social environment. The key to the model is the recognition that each individual of the distinct elements that comprise the linguistic hierarchy. This hierarchy reflects certain social strata and other structural features of society. So if we're using this aspect of familiarity with language and with the speech community as a whole, it makes sense that you could, as a person who speaks a certain language, who knows a certain subject, or engages in specific activity, you can recognize these when others speak them. In other words, in the context that is given here, the recognition by each individual that this thing is part of their world is also a big part of making the world itself. That you don't need, as a person, to speak an indigenous language of North America to know that those languages exist. And if you hear it and you expect this to happen on a semi-rare reoccurrence or occasion, then this is not particularly surprising, and you can expect that those people are part of your environment because you just know that they exist. You also know that they exist in a much lower rate, to speak in scientific terms, than other people. Now, if this system is working around nesting, then we are still using this idea of the ecological metaphor kind of that Gumpers used. Although, like I said, Gumpers does not use specifically that term, but it seems like you have these universes, and so those universes kind of imply that there is a livelihood element. And we'll get back to that towards the end of this semester anyway. But using this metaphor of the nests of diversity here, because this is how ecology works, that different animals have habitats, and within those habitats, things can thrive, and if they no longer thrive, or if the habitat disappears, then the things fall apart, rearrange, scatter around to go somewhere else. Then you can start to make sense of the speech communities as the different ways in which, like I say here, the field is arranged in terms of those variables. So social variables that we saw a second ago and the linguistic variables that you saw, the sounds, the sentences, whatever, you take your field of study, a classroom, or a university, a city, whatever, a village, and you see where those things happen. And in some specific places, you're going to have a statistically higher probability that people use this way of thinking, of this way of speaking. And in other places, you see that those people have a lower way to use those things. And around these, you create those boundaries, or you create those nests, as it's called here, where you have a linguistic community that is happening. Now, the secondary aspect that is probably the most important with this idea is what they mentioned at the end, the social strata and other structural features of society. That people, by their expectations, are kind of giving rise to those things that you understand as an expectation. And of course, if you have this awareness of others, of other groups, other people, other languages, and whatever, then you're more likely to make them part of your universe, however, distant, however related to you. That in other words, you know those people exist, they're not part of your daily lives, but you know that this is a thing that could happen, that might happen, and so therefore it is going to be part of this so-called universe. Conversely, if you do not have this amount of connection, this however impermanent connection with others, then those things are not going to appear, and so therefore it is not going to be part of the social strata, of the structure that's behind it. It's because you don't design anything, whether it's your society, your family, your language, or whatever, around the possibility that this is a thing. Now, in a grand scheme of things, this works great in environments where people are sometimes aware, sometimes not aware. That you can have a connection with somebody because they live next door, and if you live on the other side of town, you don't have this connection. Now, do you see any issues with the metaphor of the nest, if we're going to call it that? Is there a thing that could not necessarily contradict this, but maybe soften this view of how a linguistic speech community nest could work?
Maybe if, like, I can see how it worked maybe in the past, a lot more like structured, but I think maybe like present day, like with more diversity in different like social strata, that might sort of make this less concrete of an idea. And that like more diverse language users are getting into different strata.
Okay, so would you have a specific place, for example, in which this would become very complex to handle?
Is this a worldwide model, or
it could be anything?
I guess maybe here.
Here,
as in the States.
Okay, United States. Well, yeah. So United States is a place of very extreme cultural diversity when you compare it to how the world was just about 200 years ago. That up until that point, there was no place when you had indigenous folks and African American slaves and white colonizers and Asian / East Asian and Russian colonizers / also immigrants, but also there. And in other words, like 4 completely different groups of cultural identities that are in this same space. So, when this happened 300 years ago, and you had Russians in Alaska, and you had Chinese people in California, and you had indigenous folks pretty much scattered everywhere, and you had British white-ish people on the East Coast, and you had Spanish white-ish people on the southern end. Well, you could kind of see how this would work. But fast forward to here and now, and those things don't really make any sense anymore. Because if you see somebody who speaks Russian today in the United States, they could have been here for 300 years. They could also have been there for 5 minutes, because we can travel around. They could also speak Russian because they learned it at school and have no connection with Russia whatsoever. And in that case, they could be part of, a group of people who speak Russian with Russian immigrants, as much as people who learn the language at school. Again, is that a speech community? Is it a speech community when people are just using the language for the purpose of language? Do they share those aspirations that we mentioned a second ago? if the aspiration is we're speaking the language, then yes. If the aspiration is, making the USSR great again, probably not. So the biggest problem with the nesting aspect here is that language is at the center of this conversation. Is that people are focused on the linguistic aspect and the language as it transforms into ideas, but it is entirely possible that people get around the same idea and end up using the language around it. Like, video games, for example, that you use this language from playing a video game that's about delivering pies as much as you are using this to, kill another group of people. You are playing a fantasy world in which you have orcs that are flying and pigs that are exploding. And using the same language, you can also play a game when you have two people living in outer space falling in love. The ideas there are very far apart, but you're still going to use the same language to refer to these things. You're using the language of players and plays of games and XP points and all that stuff. So the ideas that are behind this conversation here are completely different from the language that people are speaking. And even more importantly is that you expect that people are actually going to agree on something. An idea of a consensus. A consensus is when people agree on an idea. Just a technical word for this. Is that if you are using this nest idea of people agreeing to use this language or that language or to refer to this people or that people, once again, you are assuming that people have had a conversation about it. Kind of how we started with Worth here, that the terms of the agreement are absolutely necessary, but the agreement is not spoken. Is that you may share a language with someone without actually sharing much of the aspirations that they have. In that case, knowing that you can use the language using the consensus of the language itself doesn't mean that you are using the larger consensus about how the world is, because that takes time, that takes effort, that takes conversation maybe to establish. Is that your neighbor could be a very fine person for 20 years as you only have very distant interactions with them. They're a great neighbor. They also murdered 3 people in their basement, but you don't know about this because you never have related with them on that level. So obviously, you have the same way to speak with them, but at the same time, you have very differing opinions about murder. And you might think that murder is a big deal when it comes to creating a community, because that's literally how you lose your people. And to make things even more complicated, if we are agreeing people based on statistics, that there's more people that believe in this and fewer people that believe in that, that also kind of focuses especially on what is essentially statistically relevant and what becomes statistically irrelevant. That if you are focusing on the language that deals with a specific group of people in a specific way, that means that that other group of people that is referred to in a specific way, they're only an object in this case. They are only part of this thing. Are they part of the speech community? In other words, that you have those neighbors that are referred to in a certain way, but you're not speaking with them, and yet you're using your shared language to speak about them. Is that part of the speech community if that person is not actively part of the conversation? So again, using an external point of reference for something that is supposed to be an internal coherence and internal, organizing principle, make things a little bit more complex than they need to be for establishing this idea of a speech community. But the problem remains that we are trying to deal with diversity in a thing that essentially cannot be unique, cannot be boiled down, reduced to essential principle. Literally, the thing that makes us who we are is the diversity. The thing that makes the language work is the diversity in language. And that's the way that we know that we are these things, is because we don't all speak the same, is that we don't all live the same. Because if we all live the same, then again, the answer would be we're all part of the same community. And again, politics, culture, language doesn't matter. Because you wouldn't have this point of reference to say, well, this person is not me. This person sounds different. This person thinks differently. This person speaks differently. That would no longer be a question. So you start with a starting point of diversity to reach a point of not diversity, which eventually gets rid of the point that we are individuals in this point. Because we've been talking about these aggregates of people, about people that have these groups that you can identify as groups. But then once you've recognized the groups, you've gotten rid of the aggregates. You've gotten rid of the fact that this is individual people that have a choice, an agency, a matter, and, well, being identified as themselves or not themselves. Which means that you're losing this aspect of the living part of your speech community. That this is a thing that had a point. You may not be seeing it when you're speaking in it, when you're engaging in it, but at a point did not exist. And then over years and years became this community that you are playing a part in, and that this thing could legitimately disappear. Maybe not tomorrow, but again, over time, kind of disappear, fall apart, fall by the wayside, and be replaced by something else. Something else that may be completely different, that could be similar enough, but again, different aspirations, different cultural attitudes, or whatever. And eventually, well, because we are making this about a weird science of communities, then we end up with speech communities that are created by the scientist, by the person who's observing it, again, by an external point that sees a social attitude, that sees a language being used, that hears specific sounds, and that tells those people using those sounds, those people showing those attitudes, well, this is your speech community. This is how you speak. This is how I see you. And so therefore, listen to me because I'm the expert. Obviously, not a great way to see communities. Not the great way to take into account the diversity that we've been talking about for about half an hour right now. Because, well, if we start with a starting point of diversity, then we should end with a starting point that's diverse, or some kind of diversity. And that's a problem that we saw very early on from language itself. It's been our problem this whole time, is that you very much have the entirety of the speech sounds that exist in every language at your disposal, and yet you really only use a selected number of them. We mentioned Mikhail Bakhtin before, Russian linguist, especially in the context of performance, talking about the fact that when you are speaking, you are performing a form of language that some people more or less agree with, but that eventually is an individual way in which you use the language as part of your growth, as part of your history, as part of the needs that you have right now. Bakhtin called this principle heteroglossia. Now, last week we talked about diglossia, when you have people that speak two languages. Well, here, heteroglossia means that you are speaking different languages. What he calls here a mixture of two social languages within the limits of a single utterance, an encounter, within the arena of an utterance between two different linguistic consciousnesses, separated from one another by an epoch, by social differentiation, or by some other factor. Now, if you can identify those things as two languages, good for you, but you may just be able to identify just two different ways to speak. which again is something that we have mentioned previously in this class, that people will have ways to speak that they identify with specific groups of people. Again, because they're their friends, maybe because there's a hierarchy there, because they have a shared language together. But it doesn't prevent them from mixing every form of language that you know to achieve your specific purpose now. To have the conversation that you need at hand, you might need to use tools that are not at hand for everyone. If you're using language to talk about science, eventually you're probably going to need scientific tools, because there are some things that you can only express with the specific words that are specifically appropriate for this thing. Is that if you're talking about snow, in the general sense, we all know what it is, it doesn't tell you what the specific kind of snow is. And again, most of the time, in the general sense, the statistical sense that we have talked about it today, it's not very important how you talk about snow. But when you need to talk about snow, which is when you will require to have this language, it is probably very important that you know the difference between snow that is falling and snow that is only on the ground, because those two things reflect on your lives differently. And if you know that there is one word for snow in the English language, and you refer to that snow as snow, there is nothing that prevents you from only saying it's snowing outside, as in there is a lot of snow falling from the sky at this point in time. You're just using a more elaborate code, or maybe a more elaborate way to use the language to convey the specific meaning that you're intending. That doesn't make you superior. That doesn't make you different language community. That doesn't make you break the language. It's making you achieve the purpose that you have within this speech community that you are in at that point in time. You can't predict that. You can't really write it down anywhere. Questions about this? Yes.
Could you define a heteroglossia again? I didn't want to.
Well, yeah, I mean, heteroglossia is what it's saying here. It's like using more than one social language at a time. So last week when we mentioned diglossia, it was specifically two languages. Here it's social languages, as they call it. So however you want to define language in this case, it could be different technical words, it could be different sounds, it could be whatever. So if you start speaking with a British accent in the middle of a sentence, it would count as heteroglossia. Not that you're using the American language just with a British accent. You're not switching two languages. Now, in a larger sense, because we have this agreement that is shared, a consensus, as we have mentioned, how do you deal with who's setting the rules here? Because it seems like anyone could set the rules, which, as far as I'm concerned, works just fine. And people just agree on whatever rules they have to do for whatever thing they're trying to achieve, right? So if they're trying to survive, then the rules are the way we survive. And whoever gets to speak about, oh, bear, well, then you say bear. It doesn't matter what your previous social status might have been. If you're the person that sees the bear, you say, even if it means breaking a social rule. And we might be best served here by looking back at this speaking acronym that we have mentioned before for the ethnography of speech, ethnography of speaking, that within a specific setting, there are participants. And how do you identify those participants? Well, first and foremost, because they're talking. And in this case, kind of let's say a silent participant in the conversation, somebody who is not actually communicating with others, even by the rules that Gumper said in the beginning here, that person would be not frequently interacting with the group. They can still listen. They can still be a receiver in this conversation. And of course, it could be a social rule that it is actually not your turn to speak. You are not expected to speak. So in that case, talking may be a sign that people have this kind of form of authority, that people who are actively using the language, even if it's for the split second when they say there, is already taking a authority as to what the rules are for that specific moment. That within that moment, the aspirations mean actually breaking the rules. Because if you don't break the rules, well, you could break up the community because somebody gets mauled by a bear. Now, what's the worst thing that could happen here? You speak at the wrong time or somebody gets mauled? Most people, maybe not me, would say that breaking the rules are the best. The next question, as far as making those rules, comes down to what exactly is keeping the community together? Again, so far the focus has been on the language itself. And the language doesn't stick very much. Mostly because anyone can speak any language, and you could be a tourist or an immigrant or some kind of other group, and people could show up and start speaking the language. It doesn't make them part of the social group. Conversely, you could say that specific practices or ways to be around allow you to keep the group together. And of course, if people are living in the same house, maybe, then within that same house, they would have ways to communicate that make sense to that house in particular and not others. Fraternities, sororities, whatever. Now, is the fact that they are sharing the same space really what's holding them together? Rather than maybe, again, the aspirations, as we have mentioned before, the whatever common goal they're trying to achieve here. However, that common goal is not necessarily spoken. It's not necessarily something that people will tell you is a thing that they do. You might have to observe that. And again, can we really focus on that as a term of authority? That the thing that is keeping the speech community together is the abstract shared goal that might have been unspoken this whole time, or that might have been spoken by an ancestor 100 years ago, 500 years ago, 6,000 years ago. And people have just kept rolling with it this whole time. There's some great goals like that, like go forth and replenish the earth. People think about these things and they're like, well, you know what? This is a good idea. I'm just going to keep on doing it, not question it at any point in time. The authority in this sentence, the authority in that speech community is kind of there, but kind of not. Alessandro Duranti, the editor of the textbook, perhaps unsurprisingly, is one of the people who kind of took this idea of the speech community to essentially what we are speaking of today, the way that we are thinking about it. Duranti calls the speech community a product. More specifically, the speech community is a product of the communicative activities engaged in by a given group of people. Now, this makes a lot of sense in terms of what we are going to talk about in a second, an economy, is that people within the context of their daily activities may require the production of specific speech communities. The one that you use at the market, the one that you use in the classroom, the one that you use with your family and whatever. And by being a person in the world, you have the tools that exist in your culture, that exist in your family, that exist in your religion, that exist in whatever, and make those things piece by piece every time that you are using this community. That in other words, yes, you might feel like you are born with this community of people that speaks the same language as you. But you might still have to make yourself part of that community as a person. First of all, because you will have to identify yourself as a person who speaks the language. Is that, yes, we can assume that we all speak that same language, but that doesn't mean that we actually do. And until somebody speaks, until they actually make themselves known as a member of that community, well, they might not be a fully functioning part. Again, they might be a silent partner within this conversation. And so Duranty goes on, this definition takes the notion of speech community to be a point of view of analysis rather than an already constituted object of inquiry. It recognizes the constitutive nature of speaking as a human activity that not only assumes but builds a community. In other words, the speech community doesn't exist. More specifically, it exists in the eye of the beholder. It exists in the person who might need to build such a community for the market, for the school, whatever. It also exists in the eye of the scientist who needs to make sense of how this language nonsense works. But that doesn't mean that it is particularly necessary for anyone to have whatever interaction they need to. Because again, I am perfectly free to be a weirdo, to talk to you at any point in time and never talk to you again. Never have any other conversation at that time I said this meaningless word to you. It's entirely possible through language. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense from a society point of view. Certainly doesn't make sense from a scientific point of view. But from where I'm standing, pretty good. Pretty fun. I made your day weird for a second. So, this point of view starts with, well, there's no community of speakers. And because we are able to use language in very various ways, including the heteroglossia that Bakhtin mentioned a second ago, this is probably the most meaningful way that we can start speaking of speech community. That it is something that is constantly being produced. And that could be reproduced, certainly, by people passing down the codes, just like in terms of diversity, we're passing on a certain amount of genes to our offspring. We're passing on a certain amount of cultural values to our offspring. But then that doesn't mean that they are actually going to be exactly like us. They are going to be kind of like us, but kind of their own as well. The language that we are speaking now is going to be kind of the language that our parents spoke, but kind of our own as well. We have different words that our parents do not use. We have different ways to relate that our parents do not have. Now, that doesn't mean that we are a different community from our parents, of course, but in a way, we are engaging in different communities as well. In other words, we are building our own communities on top of what our parents did, maybe aside from what our parents did, maybe underneath it, I don't know. It's kind of a weird 3D thinking to put these things, but in a way, it is the same, but not kind of the same. That's kind of one of our biological building blocks when you think about it. Kind of the same, but also kind of the same, but also kind of not the same. So the varieties that we have spoken about so far in this class, all those different ways in which different people use different things. Those things are going to be very useful for us scientists, for us looking at language in a specific way, to organize this extreme, weird diversity that exists in everything and everyone at all times. But it's also just one way to start thinking about this, that people will have to actively engage with those blocks, with those possibilities to become themselves, to create whatever it is that they're creating. That, yes, there are people who are speaking, and those people we can certainly identify as members of a speech community, but there are also people who are listening. And whether they are hearing it, overhearing it, listening to it, including it as part of their behavior, is a choice that they are making silently by definition. This is something that they are putting into their brain and saying, well, yeah, this is good. I'm going to be like my parents, or no, this is not what I want to be like. I'm going to make my own thing. And so from the point of view of the anthropology, as we have been defining it so far, as we have talked about it so far, that also means that what is important in terms of language is certainly the history of it, because the history is the building block. But more importantly, the ways in which people on a daily basis speak. Is that you can take one person into account at one point and see how they are looking at this thing. But also, and as most of the articles do it in this class, they're also looking at people over a period of time in a variety of spaces, in a variety of backgrounds and whatever, because anytime you hear language, you kind of get a new building block for the language. And anytime you speak to somebody, you're putting another building block in it. Anybody sometimes listen, puts a building block in their speech community as well. And if they choose not to be part of it, they remove those building blocks. They no longer produce this speech community. And they can certainly, by a sense of inertia, or maybe entropy, or whatever you want to call it, kind of just let the speech community fall apart because they no longer need it, because they no longer want to engage with those people, because, things happen, life happens. And if life happens, that also means that the life of the speech community will happen alongside of that. Now, thinking of the speech community as a thing that you produce, and again, in economical terms that we're going to see in a second, that makes the language here a commodity, a thing that we can use for the purpose of making other things. We can make representations, so we can use language to conjure certain images. But we can also use the language in very specific ways that might be more destructive. Maybe to conjure images that people do not want to think about. Again, like the weird anthropologist who talks about death all the time. And for some reason or another seems to be so obsessed by it, he mentions it in every lecture, and I can't help it, I'm sorry, but it happens. And then why? Why do we have to think about this? It's terrible. But, it's there. So you can use the words in the ways that you like them. You can use the words in the way that other people like them. You can also use the words in the way that you don't like them, or that other people don't like them. And you can borrow the words from somebody else. You can trade them. You can hear a word one day and you say, you know what, that's a good word that I'm going to keep on using, and you keep on using it. And you make that part of your weird speech community that you are creating yourself. And then somebody else will hear it and you know what, this word is great, I'm going to use it too. And all of a sudden, now you're building something together. Maybe for a minute, the weird speech community of people who use the specific term for a year or two, or maybe forget about it. And maybe just two people who just decided that, they would call each other Chuck for a night. Weird reference, I'm sorry. You can loan the words, and we've mentioned that previously in this class, that words can be loaned from one language to another because sometimes there's a culture as a whole that comes up with concepts that just make a whole lot more sense. And so, you're looking about food types, for example. So, why do you have to call ramen ramen when you could have invented a completely new word for it, or when you could just call it noodles? Well, because if you call it noodles, then you are losing what the ramen is compared to other noodles. If you're calling it something else, then you're losing whatever the ramen is to what ramen is. And I guess I'm hungry. I don't know. And then words can be lost, which also happens. And eventually, speech communities can be lost. Languages can be lost. And of course, again, we're tying this back to this weird idea of languages being alive to a certain extent, but the languages don't live in and of themselves. If we think of the speech community as a product, if we think of language as a community, as a commodity, then it kind of puts the emphasis on the fact that people have to use the language to make it work. And, if for some reason the speech community disappears for a year while you're at school, or for 5 years while a oppressive government prevents you from going back to your homeland, and then 5 years back or 50 years back, 100 years back, you get that language back again, the language is back, the people are back, the community is back. And, you've gained a whole lot more than the speech community. You've regained all the things that go alongside it. Now, if the speech community allows us to use language as a commodity, then the speech community becomes a place of exchange. And in a place of exchange, and especially if you think of it in terms of markets and perhaps free markets in a very American way, then the idea of the authority in the speech community becomes a very different concept. A concept in which anyone can have a market activity with somebody else. And you can have black market commodities, that's things that you can trade, words that you can trade, ideas that you can trade that are not necessarily approved by the rest of the community. You can do your little secret dealings, your cryptocurrency, your secret codes of using specific coded language. Because you don't want other people to see it, maybe because, it's not worth their time. It might not be worth your time, but it's fun. Which means that to a certain extent, the language cannot be fully controlled. It can just be built upon for specific amounts of time. Kind of like life. You might think that you can control life to a certain extent, but then stuff happens and all of a sudden you're out of control. And then what do? You might come up with a weird religion to make sense out of it, or you just go with whatever other weird option you have when dealing with life and not the other thing. Now, the people that are talking, speaking the language, using the language at this point at that time, become vectors for the language. Because the words won't exist unless people speak them, but also the people have to actively, specifically, speak the words for the language to come in. And people now are no longer the authority, they are part of the language activity, the communication activity that we have been mentioning this time. And if this is a place of exchange, a new question becomes, how do we invest in language? How many puts for those tendies, he asks. Because eventually, once you have the possibility to make something out of language, putting more effort, putting more thought, kind of planning around the idea of what language can do for you means that you could personally benefit from it. Maybe your group could benefit from it. Maybe you might want to bet on that language being better, stronger, faster, more efficient. So in that sense, agreeing on what language is going to be pretty important if we are looking towards the future, much more than what you are looking at now. We'll talk about that more on Thursday.